In your book, Values, which is value with the S in parentheses, basically saying that economics teaches us one kind of value, mostly exchange values, but there's other values we have for things that we may not want to exchange. And at the beginning of that book, one of the ways you lay it out is that you have a market economy, and then that doesn't mean a market society. So a market economy, the market forces, price signals, et cetera, can govern the economy. We may not want a society that's governed all by that. For most of the last few decades, we've thought, okay, let the market economy be productive, and then we'll protect those things in the society that we don't want to be from the market. Is it possible in these last few years that as we look at those things in society that we value, we're beginning to say, where is the productivity, where are the resources coming for that, and therefore we might need the market economy in order to protect our non-market society. That's the framework at the beginning of your book. That's 3 years old now, the book. Where do you think we are now on that?
Okay. So basically, we have time for one question because
Okay.
you've asked several questions in that. And let me maybe start with one. I'll start acknowledging that we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations. As well, I want to acknowledge what a great physical and virtual meeting place this is. There's a reason I'm back for the fourth time, because the quality of the questions and the discussion and the insights and the civil discourse is so high. Just one other observation at the start. Brian was saying that you reveal what you love by what you spend. I actually think it's how you spend your time. Whether how you value, your family relative to work, your community relative to other calls, and I guess just appreciate that people have already invested some time. We'll see how long everyone stays, certainly online, but that's a signal about the importance of ideas, the importance of the civic square, the essence of Cardus, and the importance of getting this balance right. Okay, so that's sort of up front. To go to the economy market society, and we were talking about this earlier, and I'm sure there's an antecedent of this concept, certainly been said in different ways, but I sort of first came across it from Michael Sandel, who's a philosopher. And it's part of the core of the book, as you say, because, and this is not about the book, but about the ideas. And the reason the S is in parentheses is because the relationship goes both ways. Between value, the market, and social goals, and from social goals to using the market. So we'll come to, I'm sure, at some point, how can we harness the market to achieve what we want to as a society, that process. But there's the other direction, which is how does the market affect society, and how does the spread of the market change the nature of certain actions, activities. And one of the things that has happened over decades has been in many countries, Canada included, where we've used market mechanisms, prices, to deliver things that normally would be outside the market. So childcare, for an example, you see it in internal markets, in healthcare in some countries as well. And there is, evidence of this, and there's evidence of this in the charitable sector. If you pay people for charity, which of course is contradiction, but to do those acts, there is a commercialization effect. By bringing something in that's traditionally a social value or social action, by putting a price on it, it affects the degree to which people do it. And in general, you find that it diminishes the price because you've tried to capture the element of it. And so that's part of this dynamic. That's actually not the question you asked, and I am going to get to the question you asked.
You may have heard of think tanks before, but have you heard of Cardus? We're here to think, to explore, to propose solutions about work, education, health, family, faith communities, and what makes a society actually thrive. Faith shapes our questions. Evidence drives our answers. If a flourishing society is a priority for you, you really ought to learn more about Cardus.
So we as Canadians value certain things, and these are choices. Those choices can change over time. Another point maybe we'll get to, remembering that, Adam Smith, moral sentiments is about how we determine what we value as a society, and those are not fixed points. But there's certain things that we value. I think one of the top things we value as Canadians is, for want of a better term, solidarity, inclusiveness, fairness, for example, in healthcare and access to social services. And now I'm starting to get to the essence of your question, which is, can we continue to provide the levels of those services across Canada and to all Canadians consistent with our values? And that is becoming more difficult. We've had the shock, obviously, of the pandemic and being hit back from that, but we do have a dreaded word to introduce in this set. Well, it's fair to introduce in this setting because it's relevant. This is the consequence of slow productivity in this country, which, if it persists, will force some very, very difficult choices. So, and I'll stop here because you'll take it where you want to, but this is about getting the balance right between market and society, between values that we share as higher values, if I can put it that way, as Canadians, solidarity, inclusiveness, fairness, responsibility is the way I would look at it, and dynamism of the economy, and how do we balance those so that we can live up to all of those values?
Well, let's go to productivity, because one of the questions when we chose the title, Can Canada Afford Its Values? One of the things that relates to what we can afford is how productive our economy is. I just took some figures this is from April, so beginning of probably first quarter of 2024, Stats Canada. So real GDP per capita has declined in 5 of the past 6 quarters, and is down around levels in 2017. During 2023, part of that is because Canada's population grew by 3% in 1 year in 2023, so that affects the per capita. But basically our GDP per capita has trended lower and is now 2.5% below pre-pandemic levels. So there's a problem. But we've been talking about productivity in Canada for at least 30 years with different parties in government, different economists. First of all, why does Canada have this chronic productivity problem, and what might be the path out of it? But why for 30 years have we been, or more than that, talking about low productivity in Canada?
Okay, so just because there's a lot of very sharp people in the audience, I'm just going to acknowledge something else, which is that one of the things we have is revisions to statistics on a fairly regular basis. So the thrust of your question remains. The actual statistics underlying it have changed, and they've changed more favorably in terms of per capita. We're now back above per capita levels, and the performance is better than it previously had been reported. I raised that in part because I remember 20 years ago when I was working at the Department of Finance, that what happened was that the previous 10 years of GDP were revised. The StatsCan does things on a periodic basis, and they were revised, and the productivity gap between Canada and the United States that had existed in the 1990s went away. So one of the productivity puzzles went away because actually we were basically what happens, and for our American listeners, I'm sorry to say this, but the Americans always overstate things. They always, so they're like the greatest country in the world, we're doing fantastic, and then they're like, maybe we're not doing quite as well. And we tend to understate things.
You picked up some things from working in London.
There's a few
British
things,
understatement.
Yeah. And that's right. It's the British influence in Canada. So we tend to understate. We count everything in the end. So we tend to revise up. They tend to revise down. So that's the second caveat. That said, the orders of magnitude now, in terms of the productivity gap between the United States and the productivity and the current level of measured productivity in Canada, is so big that there probably will be some convergence of it, but it won't go away. So why is that been the case? And there are several reasons for it, and I'll try to just summarize them.
You may have heard of think tanks before, but have you heard of Cardus? We're here to think, to explore, to propose solutions about work, education, health, family, faith communities, and what makes a society actually thrive. Faith shapes our questions. Evidence drives our answers. If a flourishing society is a priority for you, you really ought to learn more about Cardus.
The first is that we actually invest less per worker than the Americans, but the Americans and many other jurisdictions. It doesn't look like that at first cut, but you have to take away the oil sands, which has quite large investment relative to workers. And then when you look on an apples to apples basis for the rest of the economy, we invest less, first point. Secondly, we invest less in software, information communication technology, which has been part of the application of those has been part of the big productivity surge in the United States. So we do less of that. And so our workers have fewer software tools, if I can put it that way. Thirdly, there is a much bigger gap between the average, our frontier firms, our best firms, and there's a very long tail of less productive firms. So we disseminate best practice less well than the Americans do. There are also issues in terms of our industrial structure. We're more heavily weighted in industries that just globally have made fewer productivity advances, and so that brings the averages down. So those are all the one level of reason. But then we have to go to the next level and say, well, why do we invest less, and why do we give our workers fewer tools, and why are we less good at spreading expertise across the economy? What is it about our tax system? What is it about the degree of competition in the economy? What is it about our education system? What's it about business culture in the country? Are we celebrating the type of dynamism and creation that's necessary to be at the frontier? There are answers to some of those questions that can certainly close a lot of the gap with the United States, in my view. And it's becoming more, it's always an issue. It is always an issue for policymakers, for companies, for workers, for unions, to ensure that in the end that Canadian workers are getting what they deserve, which is the best opportunities. And then we as a society can apportion the benefits of that greater productivity in a way that's consistent with our values.
Are we at a stage where we can say we can't afford what our social consensus is on, say, on healthcare, you mentioned retirement security, equalization or whatever? We can't afford it unless we become more productive. Is it that urgent?
Look, if you were giving me a binary option, are you giving me a binary option? Or
They
you
might wear different colored ties, but I just wear black and white,
yeah, okay,
so that's all we get here. So
we got
the binary part of it.
The whole rainbow here with the purple tie. Look, we are our ability. Let's take the moment that we are in, Canada and the rest of the world in. I view it as a hinge moment in history. The world has changed. We're seeing another punctuation of that with the president-elect in the United States and the trade policy that's coming. Reshaping of the global economy, reshaping of our energy systems, reshaping of intelligence with artificial intelligence, a much more dangerous and divided world. So what's the consequence of all that for us? Well, we have to spend more on security. If we've learned anything by being hit by a number of crises over the course of the last 20 years, we need to invest as a society and as companies and individuals in resilience. That costs money. We have to support people through big transitions that are coming on the energy side with artificial intelligence. And we have a social model in an aging population. with, when I started in the labor force, the median age in Canada was under 30 of workers. Now it's over 40. I'm slightly over 40, so I'm bringing that average up. But that's a big, big swing. And so in that environment, that partly drives elements of, we either grow our labor force by all working longer. Part of the growth that, an important contribution of the growth in Canada the last 25, 30 years has been much higher female participation in the labor force, fundamentally positive, obviously. People working longer, fundamentally positive, and increases in migration. We're seeing the limits of migration, obviously, recently. And we're up against the limits, or closer, much closer to the limits in terms of greater participation, as people grow older. So that leaves productivity at the core. If we're going to keep our people safe, if we're going to meet our social obligations, we're going to need to become more productive. So yes, we're coming up against those limits.